So, oh wait, you want to start us off?
Yeah, don't we normally start with,
Yeah.
I'm Cory,
And I'm Isaac.
and we're going to talk about movies. Yeah.
So this is a bit of a different sort of episode today. We are tackling for the first time not a single film that was just released in theaters, but rather a broader topic. And this started off because I am going out of the country for the next couple of weeks, and we wanted to talk about something that was relevant to a film that was going to be releasing in that time period. We chose It Chapter 2. So we decided to talk about Stephen King adaptations, a handful of Stephen King adaptations that are cinematically significant for one reason or another, talk about what works and what doesn't, and try to get to the root of how to effectively adapt a novel. But our topic ended up broadening beyond that a little bit as we delved into those adaptations, and we will be touching a lot upon Stephen King adaptations. I think that'll be our primary focus still, but we have a handful of other examples of literary adaptations that we also, I think, are going to touch upon during this discussion.
Yes, first of all, bragging about going out of the country. Just going to let that one go.
Oh, okay, man.
And nextly, I was just going to say that I think a lot of where our conversations kept going and where we're going to go in this is not only just talking about adaptations in general, but also their relationship to their book and how that relationship is more than just, like you said yesterday, a regurgitation. It's not just a literal interpretation of what's happening in the book. It's something that captures audiences in a different way than seeing images of a book on the screen, essentially, right?
Right.
There's something else going on that we're trying to tease out. And one thing that we keep coming back to is this idea of how faithful adaptations relate to more creative, more out-of-the-box interpretations.
Yeah, the way that this entire conversation got started for us is by examining just the first two Stephen King adaptations, which are Carrie from 1976, directed by Brian De Palma, and The Shining, of course, directed by Stanley Kubrick, that released in 1980. And just in these are the first two King adaptations, as I already said, right? Carrie comes out in 76. What year did the book come out?
In the 70s.
Right. It only was a couple years turnaround.
And actually also his first major publication.
Right. So just by examining this initial pair of King adaptations, we get a really striking contrast in the approach that's taken to adapt the source material for the big screen. So do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, the speed in which these books were adapted into films is kind of astounding, especially considering how quickly it picked up in the 80s, right? There's one in the 70s, and then 10 or so Stephen King adaptations that come out in the 80s. I think that's clear of, like, not only his frequency of writing, but also how much it had captured people's attention and imagination.
Right. Stephen King has become one of the number one sources for Hollywood literary adaptations. His cinematic output in terms of films that have released in the last 3 decades that have been adapted from his work, probably second to none in terms of the sheer volume. I don't know what other authors could possibly have inspired as many film adaptations as King has. This is a disconnected stories that the same author has dreamt up.
Definitely unique. Definitely the top of the pack.
And Stephen King continues to capture the imaginations of moviegoers, which is exemplified by the tremendous success of the It adaptation from 2017. That was an enormous box office success and a critical darling, and also extremely well liked by the general movie-going public, and has a very hyped up sequel coming out that, as I mentioned before, was what prompted us to have this conversation in the first place. But ultimately this conversation is not really going to relate specifically to It Chapter 2.
Right, because we haven't seen it.
We'll be talking about the first It movie, but that's for another time. Let's go back for now to what we were just starting out to talk about, which was the root of all of the King mania, right? Carrie and The Shining.
Yeah, so I know that the movie came out to mixed reviews just because it was so weird. I think everybody who is listening has probably seen it at this point. So the creative liberties taken with how the events in the movie were portrayed ended up not hitting with everyone initially.
Mm-hmm.
It, open to mixed reviews,
including
but has since
King himself.
including King
famously
himself, but has since grown to be one of his most popular movies, Stanley Kubrick's most popular movies, as well as I believe one of his most successful financially. So I think that just says something about the nature of an adaptation, and I think that one of the reasons that why there's so many King adaptation movies has to do with money as well, because it's like a legacy thing at this point.
His name is a brand for one, and also his stories have proved to be lucrative, even those that weren't literary phenomenons when they released. Like, one example that comes to mind is The Shawshank Redemption. That was a short story, and I think that the story that film is based on is nowhere near as well known as the movie that came out of it.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's lean. It's only 100 or so pages, and it also is collected with The Body, which was made into the movie Stand By Me, as well as Apt People, which also had an adaptation that was not well received. I think it was actually directed by Bryan Singer, interestingly, but just
before he
fell in
little boys
fell into obscurity for sure and was not good.
So what is it that makes for an effective Stephen King adaptation? I think that's the question that we initially set out to try to answer. And it is tempting to say that the stories of Stephen King are just so compelling and, rife with effective drama and terror that following those stories just naturally leads to fun, solid cinematic entertainment. But that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, it is certain that if you've read a Stephen King book, you know that he is kind of presented now as like an everyman, right? He's from Maine. He doesn't use a lot of like fancy language. It's very clearly written, and the events and thoughts of the characters are very clearly portrayed. There's not a lot hidden, especially in his his horror books, which are more just procedurally laid out to unveil what's happening. So there's nothing like particularly fancy or impressive about, his writing. And I think that's one thing that helps filmmakers and screenwriters put such a stamp on some of the adaptations. There's so much simple yet effective stuff going on in the book that people have been able to take that and change it enough a little bit to make it into an effective movie.
On the other hand, what makes the book so simple and effective sometimes is the straightforwardness of the psychological goings-on that are portrayed. Like, he will write from a specific character's point of view, and it's very clear what thought processes are going on in that character's mind because of the nature of an omniscient narrator in a book, getting into the characters' heads and being able to understand all of their thoughts and emotions and stuff. And it's extremely difficult, or at least very different, to replicate that effect on screen in a way that's effective. And I think that a lot of the failings that we see in King adaptations are the ones that try to just show on screen those elements from the book that work already in visual form and just neglect to include everything else. The novels have essential elements that are very difficult to put on screen. And so when you just adapt them straightforwardly, it can lead to problems if you don't get creative when it comes to depicting the psychological side that King holds so dearly in his novels.
It's a solid theme about all of them, right? It's not just random events happening to random characters. We get drawn in by the very human perspective put on through the characters, and we get sucked in by the real emotion and real psychological toll that is happening to people in these usually supernatural situations, right?
So what if we actually gave a couple examples of the characters that we're talking about, and maybe one that is translated really effectively on the big screen, and then another that is not?
Let's start with Carrie White then, I think.
Sure. Yeah, we'll start at the beginning like we said we were going to about 5 times now. Sorry about that. Keep going.
I think the Carrie adaptation speaks really well to our point and to the point of making a good adaptation in general, which is just that there needs to be a little bit more done on the filmmaking side because of our inability to hear what the characters are thinking in a movie. We get that first-person perspective of Carrie, kind of first-person anyway. We get an omniscient perspective from Carrie in the book.
You're talking about.
Yes.
Right.
And in the movie, we can't possibly get that.
Or you can do it. The most straightforward method of that kind of narration is vocal narration.
Right, exactly.
And we the character talking over the images, and that is often seen as a very lazy narrative device. And there are examples of effective uses of vocal narration in film, but there are a lot more examples of it just being obtuse and distracting and blunt.
So let's go back to Carrie, where we don't have any narration in the movie. Instead, what we get is a emotional portrayal of all the horrors that are being subjected onto her, right? Instead of, in the book, we're getting all this focus on a lot of supernatural elements and a lot of crazy psychic stuff that ends up leading to the horror at the end. We're getting, instead, a very human perspective on everything, right? The horror of being humiliated at school, the horror of having a terrible home life.
And I know what you were speaking to when we were talking about this in preparation for this episode was the fact that the book, so both the book and the film build up to this climactic prom sequence that is sort of an explosion of all of the built-up tension that came before it. But I think that you were talking about how there's a difference in terms of what kind of tension is building in the book versus in the film.
Yeah, the way that I interpreted that was because there's so much focus on the supernatural psychic aspects in the book, there's cuts to book entries, fake book entries about the events. Before we even see the prom night, we get little asides about the horrors of what happened that night and, the foreshadowing and psychic elements that we see throughout. And we don't really see that in the movie. Instead, what we get is the tension building up through a portrayal of the character. It's these horrors being subjected onto her, these terrible things building up slowly and slowly until that final breaking point. Then the supernatural element comes out. So it's more like the building up is a more realistic, or at least visually capturing, because it's more human, right? It's more relatable than supernatural stuff happening. Where it's really more so than the book, I thought anyway, trying to capture that caste-like system of being in school. The hierarchy of people in the different school levels. I don't know.
And I think not necessarily just the high school hierarchy, but also the oppressive presence of Carrie's mother in her life, and the amount that she is asked to suppress herself and her urges.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right? She is a very much traumatized figure in the film, and so I think what you much more see in the film, I haven't read the book, so you're gonna have to speak on that, but in the film, what you get is a bombardment of traumas upon this central character, Carrie White, that explodes in this burst of hatred and anger and just repressed emotion in the prom scene. And just speaking briefly to the filmmaking craft of that scene, right, we have a very, for the most part, straightforward, unassuming direction by De Palma up to that point. And then that prom scene is one of the most famously technical, climactic sequences probably in horror cinema history, with the split screen camera and just the bombardment of practical effects and the, of course, famous pig's blood imagery that's just strikingly portrayed. It's a absolutely striking and bombastic sequence in what is, up to that point, a pretty quiet film.
Yeah, we get none of that visual and technical side of it beforehand. I'd say more so in the book we do get images of other things happening, like them killing the pigs to prepare, and so we get other horrible things and other views of terrible people in the book, but instead it's in the movie we're building up to those horrors at the end, right? It's slowly working up through the pressure putting on Carrie, it's a very psychological tension, right? It's weird that it's almost the opposite of what you would expect. Even though the book focuses on those psychological elements, it ends up coming across in a less sympathetic way, I thought. And the movie, because it's focusing on the human side of it, right? The human aspects of it, we get that real psychological toll. It never has to be told to us because we can see it and feel what's happening to us.
That immediately does away with the preconception that it's impossible for a film to portray or to explore a character's psychology to the extent that a book does, because this example we're giving is actually an example of the film leaning more heavily into the psychological traumas than the book does.
Right? Yeah. By the end of the Carrie book story, it's rampaging, killing a lot of people. The death toll is insanely high. It's really tragic and really sad, but I wouldn't say I was sympathetic for her. You know what I mean? Because just because the toll and breaking insanity, while tragic, it's hard to put into words that, I think. It's easier to just show it in a kind of like villainous way, right? Her destroying a whole town, her killing hundreds of people. Instead, it's more isolated in the movie. It feels like she's enacting a very specific revenge.
Yes,
right?
And you also see how incredibly distraught she is throughout the entire sequence.
Yeah.
You have...
It's both visually terrifying and also kind of heroic, right? It's like she's enacting this final revenge on everyone that did her wrong. Not that, I mean, I would say that's like a realistic or good way to say that, but that's kind of how you feel. Like you want Carrie to have a win.
Sometimes you gotta get a bit of catharsis by, blowing up a car and electrocuting your principal. It just has to happen sometimes. Yeah. So I think that I would like to shift the conversation a little bit. And now that we've explored how the film adaptation of Carrie manages to stay faithful to the novel while still being an effective film, let's look at another adaptation that has a character who in King's novel is similarly psychologically traumatized. And I'm thinking of Pet Sematary, actually.
Yeah, okay, big jump.
I'm thinking of Lewis, the main character, the father character in Pet Sematary, who in King's novel has this extraordinarily intense experience of grief that comes as a result of losing a child. It results in him acting irrationally and grasping for impossibilities that he knows he shouldn't be grasping for, but is compelled to because of this horrific grief that is just infecting him and preventing him from seeing anything besides the hope of seeing his child again. Right. Or less, right. To completely spoil Pet Sematary.
Right. I think everybody knows at this point. They basically show it in the trailer for the new adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. Like they even showed like the change, right? That they kind of hinted at that the daughter was going to die.
Back.
Yeah, exactly. And
they don't hint at. There's actually in the trailer, in the second trailer for the new Pet Sematary, you straight up see the daughter.
So
funeral,
that change,
like you see her
that
die,
spoiled. That was completely spoiled.
Right.
That change. So anyway, that made no sense.
But disregarding that change, which I think we can talk about, but I'm more interested right now in the main character Lewis and how his portrayal in the film versus the novel can be related to Carrie's portrayal in the film versus the novel.
Okay, I think why Pet Sematary was kind of unsuccessful in its adaptation in relating to
we're talking about the
main
Pet
character.
Sematary, by the way, 2019 Pet Sematary.
Right. But it failed in both. I think the reason why in the new one it failed is because the story itself is pretty simple. It's not a like groundbreaking story, but in the book, like you said, we get so much insight into how we deal with grief and losing someone that close to you. I mean, a million movies, a million stories have talked about how difficult and impossible it is to deal with losing a child. It's something that no one should ever have to go through because it's so psychologically and life-alteringly difficult to deal with.
Right.
Because you can't say that because you can't hear what that person is thinking and their inner dialogue. We have to somehow see that in Pet Sematary in the movies, and we just don't, right? We just see the events and his sullen look of, I'm sad that my daughter or son is dead, whichever adaptation you're doing. I'm sad that my child is dead, but now I'm gonna go take them and bring them back to life.
His actions in the film come across as just plainly irrational and also unfounded. It just doesn't feel like the plot points that the film is portraying are at all earned by the psychological states of the characters. There's no underlying sense of the psychological experience driving the horror.
Right,
we don't just the horror depicted on screen.
Yeah, we just get a straight jump from seeing the daughter getting hit with a car in the new movie, or by a truck, and straight to the daughter being buried and then coming back. Right? We hardly see any of what Lewis is doing, what he's thinking, what he's going through. It's almost like they just jumped right past that, right?
And because that's the hard part to portray, right? We get all of the easy visual horror, the creepy zombie cat, and the tense daughter getting hit by a truck scene, and the creepy pet cemetery trek in the nighttime, right? We get all of that easy visual horror, and the psychological side is just neglected, and there's nothing in its place. There's no shift in the focus like we saw in Carrie, with the shift in the focus from the supernatural to the psychological trauma.
Yeah.
There's no adaptation in this adaptation. It's just regurgitation.
Yeah, agreed. I think by now we've kind of teased out the idea that you can't just put the images of what's happening on the screen to make the adaptation, right? We need another element. We need what we think we need here is a kind of reading, an interpretation by the screenwriters, by the director, in order to put something that we didn't see before in the book onto the movie. Because if we don't get anything else there, it's like you said, it's just regurgitation.
Yeah, we talked about this last night. I really liked where we got on this topic in our brief conversation last night about how an effective cinematic adaptation is almost like a review of the book by the filmmaker, right? It's the filmmaker saying, I read this book, and obviously this is a combined vision, the director, the screenwriter, and everyone else involved, the editor, as well as intrinsically involved in this whole adaptation process. But it's all of those people coming together and depicting their experience of this story on screen, right? They are giving it their spin. They are reading it a certain way. They're saying, here's what I got out of the book, and they're teasing out the elements that they found striking, or they're putting a certain meaning on top of the events that the book portrayed, right?
Yeah. And I think also importantly, right, is the acting interpretation, right? Think of how much work has to go into coordinating between a screenwriter and director and the actor of that character in order to portray the vision that they want out of a book adaptation.
Yeah. I think that segues perfectly into what is probably the ultimate example of a director putting their own spin on a Stephen King novel concept, which is The Shining.
Right. And I think from everything we just said, that's one of the reasons why The Shining is so enduring as a movie, because it has so much wrapped up into it now that it's almost more than just a movie at this point, right? It's a cultural phenomenon. This idea that you can take a source material from a book to a movie and make it into something completely different while using basically the same ideas to portray new insights that we did not see at all before.
So The Shining does this by, well, actually, I think you spoke better to the way that The Shining, so what you were talking about was how the film version of The Shining is much more of a social critique than the novel ever was meant to be, right?
Yeah,
they're both about a family isolated in a hotel in the wintertime, and there's spooky supernatural stuff going on.
Yeah, I think we've got down to the root of pretty much every Stephen King book, right? It's a supernatural, something horrific happening that is a little bit outside of reality, and a real psychological human toll that's happening to the main character that we're viewing through their eyes.
That's his formula, and it's such a good formula.
Right, it works. It's a threaded theme that he says differently each time, but it means, right, we get the same meaning. In the movie, I think what Stanley Kubrick was thinking is that it's impossible to tell that story without making it straightforward and still making a good, unique movie. So I think that was one of the reasons why he altered it so much, is because he wanted to say the same thing as the book. he wanted to say something different also, right? He wanted to put the events of the book into his own idea. And the way he used that was through a very cold interpretation of everything. Instead of seeing the breakdown of Jack Torrance's thoughts and his
entire
his entire mental state, his slow weathering away of his ability to fend off the like ghosts and things influencing his mental state in the hotel. Instead, what we see is this very stark depiction of a man isolated with his family, slowly losing his ability to cope with being like a protector and a provider for his family. It's saying that he is put into this situation like every father is in society, with a certain expectation, you know, because of how they were raised, how society is currently, and slowly unraveling to the point where he can't cope with those expectations any longer. He, for some reason, can't deal with taking care of his family anymore. You know, something that we all think of and take for granted as so simple. His entire mental state collapses around that idea. And I think why that's a social critique is it's about the situation that families are put in America. How I am seeing this is like, you know, it's talking about families put into a traditional situation. They all have their own background, their own things that they have to deal with. In The Shining, it's alcoholism. Oh, and the like anger issues, right? They talk about that too, right? So because of that background and being put in an isolated situation with his family, he slowly unravels because he can't repress that anymore. Because of whatever's happening around him, because he's not able to distract himself from it anymore. It just slowly weathers away.
Well, I mean, I think, there's a lot going on in The Shining. You can watch a documentary like Room 237 for more information about how there's also subliminal messages about how Stanley Kubrick helped fake the moon landing.
Right.
And also more legitimate hypotheses regarding the imagery in the film that suggests a anti-colonialism message, specifically with regard to the genocide of Native Americans, right? There's a lot of stuff going on, but what you're talking about there is sort of this core theme of the deteriorating family structure.
Yeah.
And that is, I don't think anyone would argue against the fact that that is one of the core thematic elements of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. I think it's also one of the core thematic elements of Stephen King's The Shining, but it's definitely portrayed very differently, like you said, right? We get inside the head of Jack Torrance as opposed to staying outside and watching the coldly viewing from a distanced point of view this creeping sense of isolation, this dread, and this ultimately abject horror, right? The book shows Jack Torrance fighting off the horrors of this hotel, the hedge monsters, right?
Yeah.
And the bug people that are in the ballroom when the clock strikes midnight.
Oh, right, yeah.
There's this whole oppressive atmosphere that Jack is sort of trying to fend off and then fails to fend off.
Right, slowly succumbs to it over the course of the novel.
Yeah. Whereas in the film, he does slowly succumb to it, but we aren't focused on his internal experience of it. We are simply focused on what his succumbing to this darkness does to the family and to him, ultimately.
And I think it also says, okay, for the one thing that I was thinking is that it's kind of opposite as Carrie, in that in the book, I see Jack as a sympathetic character. He's trying to deal with all these issues, and he's unable to fend them off after from being slowly weathered over the course of the book. In the movie, you see, for some reason, you know, whether it's the portrayal by Jack Nicholson, whether it's Stanley Kubrick's direction, you see that, like, villainous creepiness of Jack the whole time. And it's like it was inside him all along, and we knew it was coming because of, I don't know, how he acted, how weird all their interactions were from the beginning, how weird everything was from the beginning. There's nothing normal. It's not like, oh, a normal family coming into a crazy situation. It's a clearly, you know, psychotic person finally weathering away all the defenses that he had thanks to the distractions of the normal world, and using that to basically snap and kill his family.
Right. And so that is how Stanley Kubrick ends up making the same base events as happened in the Shining novel, into a completely different feeling experience in the movie, as opposed to something like Pet Sematary, which also mirrors the narrative beats of the King novel, but does nothing to shift the focus away from the psychological void that its characters' inner thoughts and feelings, right? Like, you don't see any of that in Pet Sematary, and you don't necessarily see that much of it in The Shining either, but what you have instead is a very striking cinematic experience of insanity and isolation and creeping horror and the breakdown of social structures, right? There's so much more going on there that replaces what was lost, more or less.
I'll be back.